Peace and light, that old guy Australia. Like, share, subscribe, Instagram and YouTube while we still can. Look, I was asked to do a video on the voice to the Australian Parliament, and I hesitated about it, and I wasn't really sure I wanted to do anything on it. A, because I don't have all the facts. I'm not sure who has, but even Albanese doesn't. But not only that, because there's some wonderful, wonderful people like Grandmother Malara and Jacinta Price, Warren Mundine, others who've done plenty of videos about this. Sky News covered it. But what bothered me, I think, most about this entire thing is the current legislation that's being proposed by the Albanese government, which will see the cessation and a complete censorship of all information that is negative to the narrative regarding the voice. Now, this is due in Parliament in about a week, and the proposal, and I've put a post on my page you can go and have a look at, by a wonderful lady who is a PhD in law and Rhodes Scholar, and her explanation of what's happening with this new legislation proposed by Albanese's government is some of the most frightening legislation ever seen in Australia's history. If you don't know, they've got a committee called ACMA, and ACMA is made up of hand-picked people, and these people are going to decide what is truth and what is not truth. I mean, just think about that statement for a second. These people, I think there's about 10 of them, hand-picked, will decide what is truth and what is not truth. And if it falls under the guise, for them, of disinformation or mistruth, they will censor it. And if they censor you, they will delete your account. You'll no longer be able to avail yourself of social media. The other side of that is they're saying that they will impose very large fines upon social media platforms that allow misinformation to be published. Now, I assure you 100% they're not going to impose fines upon Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, anything. They're just not going to do it. That's just a lie. It's an absolute lie. And it's a smokescreen to cover their own backsides, because the social media platforms will censor you and ban you, and they'll say it wasn't their fault. They had received notification from the government, from the agency, ACMA, that this information was incorrect, false, and misinformation, misleading, harmful, detrimental, whatever it might be, and they will then censor you, saying that they were under the threat of a major fine. But that's just all paperwork. There's nothing to it. This is an absolute joint effort on behalf of social media platforms and the, governments around the world, because this is not just happening in Australia. This is happening in England. It's a huge push in America. And this morning I received information that the American government under Biden has put in I can't think of the word right at this second, but it's a court-ordered halt in the banning of the legislation that would stop them censoring. Okay, so they've still got that in place while this court order remains, and of course we know that the judicial system in America is beholden to the government. So how long this is going to last, we don't know. But censorship in America is real. Censorship in Europe is real. Censorship in England is real. In pretty much every country around the world. This is a joint effort from governments everywhere to ensure that the truth, the absolute truth, never gets out. But the interesting part of that, of course, is not only that. I mean, think about it logically. If you're watching this and you think, well, stopping misinformation is a good thing. Well, how do you determine what's misinformation? If I say the air's blue and you go, well, it's actually not, it's clear, but it's made up of particular crystals, and when sunlight hits it, blah, 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 I go, it's freaking blue, and you go, well, it's actually not. Who's telling the truth? Or is it just that you can't have an opinion? And if you have an opinion that is outside the accepted narrative that the air is blue, and even though it may be able to be proven that it's not blue at all, If it goes against the narrative and they ban you and say, well, you're not allowed to hold that opinion, how is that democracy? How is that right? How's that just basic sense? And this is what they're trying to do. The interesting part about this new legislation being introduced by Albanese government is that the government itself doesn't come under this act. It doesn't come under the act. It is not beholden to the act. It can say whatever it wants to say, and none of its information is censored or checked. So what you're basically seeing is a form of Nazism, where they're saying, look, the government's going to give you the narrative, and that's the only narrative you can have. If you speak outside that narrative, we will ban you, censor you, fine you. Now, you remember a year and a half ago when Jacinda Ardern was in power in New Zealand as their Prime Minister, she held a press conference where she said the only information you need to know is what the government's telling you. Anything outside that you don't need to know about. And I was straight away, we know that she was a graduate of the World Economic Forum's Young Globalist Leaders program. We also know that earlier this year, when Albanese won office as Prime Minister of Australia, he immediately had a visit from Bill Gates, software developer who's also major funder of the World Economic Forum and the largest private landholder of farmland in America, and one of the major holders of injection laboratories worldwide. Now, the details of that meeting, Mr. Albanese declared that he was not going to make public. We didn't need to know. It was on a need-to-know basis, and you didn't need to know. You didn't need to know why a software billionaire flew over to Australia to greet the new Prime Minister of Australia and hold a private meeting with him, of which no details are available. You don't need to know that. And you also don't need to know that not so many weeks after that, a former President of the United States, some say former, I don't, a former President of the United States, Barack Obama, also flew to Australia and had a private meeting with Prime Minister Albanese. Now, the details of that meeting itself also remain confidential, and Mr. Albanese will refuse to release any of those details ever. Even when asked, he said no. So we're facing a situation here in Australia where free speech, which has never been really there, but the last remnants of it is going to be taken from us entirely. We're not going to be able to hold an opinion that is different or questions the government's stance and narrative. You're just not going to be able to. Now, if you think that that's some kind of a good thing, then explain to me. Why is it you can't question? Why can't you? When has there ever been a time in history where you couldn't question a government over their decisions? When has there ever been a time in history when you couldn't at least question them? You may not change them, but when could you not question? And does this apply to the media, which is beholden to the government anyway? Are they allowed to question the government? Are they allowed to ask hard questions? They never do now. I've known several reporters who have been quoted as saying that the questions they want to ask in certain situations, they're not allowed to ask. They know that. They can't ask them. So this is going to silence a lot of people. Now, this legislation is due to be brought in prior to the referendum, which will be a deciding vote by Australians on whether or not the voice, the Aboriginal voice to Parliament, should be incorporated into our constitution. Now, this is a really, really difficult situation because 99.9% of Australians know very little about constitutional law, or even what the constitution is, or how to go about reading it or find it. They just simply don't care. They really don't care. They just want to get on with life. But the problem is that constitution is the only thing that keeps us as a nation. It is the only thing. There's nothing else. It separates the government from total anarchy here. And I mean top-down anarchy. Not us, not the population, but them themselves. I mean, the traitorous actions of these previous governments and the one today should be enough for them to be held accountable in a court of law, but it's not. They have billions of dollars of taxpayers at work. They have the right people in the right pocket. And there's very few who can actually challenge and confront them. Wayne Glue's one, who knows his constitutional law brilliantly. And Grandmother Malara knows her Indigenous law and the law of the Aboriginal people. And she's also has a huge wealth of knowledge of our constitutional law. But they're few and far between. And the cost to take these governments on with their massive teams of legal experts is very, very expensive and difficult to do, as we know. They can investigate a bus crash and charge the guy within 2 days and have him arraigned before court, but they can take 2 years to pay somebody or hear a case about somebody who received an injection that was near fatal or fatal and have them pay out a few $1,000s to help them on their way. So we know the law only favours those whose narrative they support. Anyway, a little off target there, but the point is that the people who are going to be silenced are going to be also those ones, Indigenous people, who have spoken out against this proposed voice to Parliament. They're going to be silenced. They won't be able to be seen or heard anywhere. And you'll note, if you look around, you'll note that the majority of the people who are interviewed are supporting it. And we have all the major sporting groups, which is a saddening thing for me. The bodies of those sporting groups are coming out and saying, well, we support the voice to Parliament. That's NRL, AFL, soccer, basketball, netball, everything else. Yet we also know in amongst those are players who are absolutely furious that they're being misrepresented. They don't support the voice at all, but they have no say in it because they're saying as an organisation, we support this. So this is a push they're trying to get across to Australian people, that you have to get this through. Now, the big question it begs, of course, is why is it such a huge push to have the Indigenous people of Australia incorporated into the Constitution of Australia? And that question isn't so hard to answer. As Grandmother Malara points out, Australian Indigenous people never, ever, ever signed Australia over to the English, never signed them over to the government, never gave them control, never gave them consent. They never sold Australia to the government. The government, as Grandmother Malara points out, is a false government. It's not a true government because it doesn't represent all the people. And you can say, yes, well, it doesn't represent the Indigenous people. But if they incorporate the Indigenous peoples of Australia as a whole into the Constitution of Australia, that then encompasses everybody within the borders of Australia as a nation. Now, we know that 68 countries and counting have signed the United Nations Epidemic Treaty, for want of a better phrase. This is one where the United Nations have drafted a legislation that enables them to enter any country, where they, the UN, declare there is a pandemic. Now, they can enter that country en masse. They don't even have to have any authority to do so. They have that legislation, and that enables them to come in. They can enter any country with their forces anytime, anywhere they want to. And they also have within that legislation the ability to force vaccinate and to control the populations of those countries. Now, this is a document. You can find it on the United Nations website. This is not some kind of conspiracy stuff. This is true. It's there. 68 countries plus have signed on to this, but Australia hasn't. And the very reason they haven't signed on to, because legally they can't, not until the Indigenous people of Australia are enshrined within the Constitution of Australia, thereby representing the vast population of Australia. You need to understand that fact. It's a legal technicality that the Albanese government know well about. They've had it pointed out to them at the G7 meetings. They've had it pointed out to them at Davos at the World Economic Forum's meetings. They've had it pointed out that we need to encompass Indigenous peoples of Australia into the Constitution, so enshrine them in there. Until then, they cannot sign the treaties with the United Nations. That's such a huge issue. Now, there's enormous amounts of politicians and good people calling on the government to withdraw from the United Nations. But that's not going to be the case at this stage. And I don't want to be a wet blanket, but I personally don't see that changing. I see this going pushed through. The referendum for a yes, and this is a draft plan that has no boundaries, no borders. It actually has no policies. It has inferences and intimations and suggestions of what it could be, but there's no absolute concrete legislation for what the voice truly is. But what it infers is incredibly dangerous, really dangerous, because the inference in the wording so far covers pretty much every area, legally, socially and economically, of Australia and our way of life. And things will change. Things will change. And you can't blame the Indigenous people for it, because in amongst those people are power pushers, power brokers, or as Warren Mundine calls them, blacktivists, whose only goal is to ensure financially and monetarily, with the help from the government, that they push this through. Once that referendum is held, we know that voting is fast. We know that they can get any outcome they want, and you can't ever question it. But for that lead up to the referendum, which will be months away, there'll be no talking from the no sector. It will all be censored and banned. And we know that because the government is pushing through this legislation in about a week for misinformation campaign. So if you stand up, like I'm doing right now, and say that enshrining the Indigenous people within the Constitution of Australia will allow the United Nations to exercise their legal legislated treaties to enter Australia without any authority. If you say that, well, that's misinformation. We'll censor you, we'll ban you, we'll remove you from social media. So this may be one of the very few times I get to put this out there. Now, I'm putting it out there simply. I assure you there's far more to this than what I'm saying. This is just me, that old guy Australia, giving you an overview. Technically and legally, it's far deeper than this. It goes far deeper than this. But this is just an overview because I was asked to do something. Now, I could look at this video and watch it back and go, oh my God, and do it again and again and again and add bits and pieces. I could write signs out and have them over there, like be looking at them and do dot point forms and whatever. But I couldn't be bothered, to be honest. I got better things to do. But I was asked to do a video whereby they could possibly explain what's happening with the Voice to Australia. The amount of no within the Indigenous people is massive. Now, you would have seen those who wrote the Uluru Statement from the Heart, those who signed that. They came out, and that wasn't even covered by mainstream media. They came out and were absolutely furious that their names had been added to the Voice to the Parliament support page. Now, they were furious when they were interviewed, they said, no, we didn't do this. We don't condone it. We don't even agree with the Voice to Parliament. These are Indigenous people out of Uluru who wrote and signed the Statement from the Heart. So that was false, and that was lies from the government and also from the man who's running this campaign, a man who, if you watch his videos, he publicly states he's an avowed communist. Now, he's an Indigenous man, and he's been travelling the width and breadth of Australia because he is a brilliant speaker, I tell you, highly educated, very good speaker, quite eloquent, and he's been put in charge as an Indigenous man of organising support for the Voice to the Parliament. But his public videos, he clearly states he's an avowed communist. Now, that should worry you. That should truly worry you. So I'd tell you now, I'd urge you, you've got to understand what's going to happen. If this legislation goes through that the Albanese government's trying to push through for misinformation bill, then you won't hear a bip from anybody who speaks against the Voice to Parliament. What you will hear is the $300 million they've pledged to ramp up the Yes campaign between the passing of that legislation and the referendum, because that's all you'll hear. And they will numb you. They will blast you with it on radio stations, on TV stations, on social media sites. They will blast you and blast you and blast you. And if you try and go on a social media page that has some post about the Yes, and you try to comment on there, and you put up a comment that's against the narrative, you will have that comment removed and you will be censored and banned. So that the only comments that would appear to be supportive of that narrative. Now, how is that democracy? How is that not communism? How is that not communism? Because Mr. Mayo, the leader of this group, is an avowed communist himself, and he's the man the government's relying on to push this through. That's all I want to say about it. There's much, much better people who've spoken far more eloquently than I can. I'd urge you to look for Grandmother Malara, Dave Cole, Lermper, Jacinta Price, Warren Mundine, and many, many, many others. Bruce Shillingsworth. There's so many speaking against this. And they represent the vast majority of non-narrative addicted Indigenous people. Those who, Warren Mundine points out, are doing this from a sense of gaining power and financial settlement of some sort. It's all done for money and power. But they do not represent the vast majority of Indigenous people here in Australia. Peace and light. That old guy Australia. Like, share, subscribe, and we'll catch you soon.